December 1944. In the frozen Ardennes forest of Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge reached its most desperate chapter, Bastogne. Here, barely 11,000 American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division and a few supporting units found themselves encircled by more than 45,000 German soldiers and nearly 200 tanks, cut off from supplies, battered by snowstorms, and without air support. They faced impossible odds. Yet their defiance turned this small crossroads town into legend. When the German commander demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe answered with a single word, "Nuts," a reply that echoed far beyond the snowbound foxholes. What made this siege extraordinary was not only the courage of men freezing and starving in their trenches, but also the way their stand stalled Hitler's last great offensive. Bastogne was the fulcrum of the entire Ardennes campaign. Hold the town, and the German drive to Antwerp collapsed. Lose it, and the Western Front might have been torn apart against overwhelming numbers. The stand at Bastogne proved that morale, stubbornness, and unity could outweigh firepower. It was more than a battle. It was the moment America's will froze the German advance in its tracks. December 1944, the Ardennes forest of Belgium lay under a crushing winter. Temperatures plunged below zero, snowdrifts buried the narrow roads, and frozen fog clung to the bare branches. Into this silence came the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. Hitler's last gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, hurled more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, through the wooded hills. Their goal was audacious: split the Allied front, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At the very heart of this offensive lay a crossroads town of only 4,000 civilians. Its name was Bastogne, a small dot on the map, yet the junction of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the arteries of movement in the Ardennes. Inside the town, barely 11,000 Americans, most of them paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division and a handful of artillery units, scrambled to dig foxholes into frozen ground. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division, knew the stakes. If Bastogne fell, the German 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, could drive west unchecked. If it held, the German timetable collapsed. The math was brutal: 1 American for every 4 German soldiers, a handful of Shermans against nearly 200 Panzers, and artillery shells rationed to a few per gun each day. Yet McAuliffe's orders were clear: hold Bastogne at all costs. The first waves struck on December 19. Columns of German Volksgrenadiers surged through the snow. Supported by armored spearheads, artillery pounded the American perimeter, as many as 500 shells an hour landing on the town and its outskirts. Houses caught fire, barns collapsed, and wounded soldiers were carried into cellars already overflowing with civilians seeking shelter. Private First Class Eugene Rowe of Easy Company, 106th Parachute Infantry Regiment, later recalled, "The ground shook constantly. The snow turned black with soot, and men prayed in silence, hoping each shell would fall somewhere else. Despite the bombardment, the paratroopers clung to their foxholes. The defenders stretched thin, sometimes one squad holding 500 yards of front at Noville, a village north of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade's task force fought against overwhelming numbers of German tanks from the 2nd Panzer Division, outnumbered more than 6-1. Laprade's men delayed the enemy for an entire day before being forced back, leaving dozens of burning Shermans and destroyed half-tracks behind them. Their sacrifice bought time for the perimeter at Bastogne to solidify as the ring of steel closed. Conditions inside the town deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures hovered at minus 10 degrees Celsius. Snow-covered foxholes. Rations froze solid, and medical supplies dwindled. By December 21, more than 500 wounded soldiers filled the makeshift hospital in the seminary building. Morphine was exhausted, bandages torn from bed sheets, and candles used for light in the windowless cellar. Nurse Augusta Chive, a Belgian volunteer, described the scene. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, some groaning, some already dead. We had no more medicine. Only courage kept us going. And German pressure mounted with each passing hour. Panzer Lehr and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the east, while the 2nd Panzer and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division encircled from the north and south. Reconnaissance units from the 5th Panzer Army sealed the western exits. By December 22, Bastogne was completely surrounded. Radio messages confirmed the dire situation. No reinforcements could break through the snow-choked roads, and poor weather grounded Allied aircraft. The defenders were on their own. Yet even in this bleak reality, morale hardened. A captured German officer reported in interrogation that the Americans seemed stubborn beyond reason. McAuliffe encouraged his men with calm confidence. He told his staff, "We are surrounded. That simplifies things. Now we can attack in any direction." The remark spread quickly through the foxholes. Lifting spirits in the freezing night, the siege of Bastogne had begun in earnest against overwhelming numbers, with dwindling supplies and no relief in sight. 11,000 Americans stood in the path of Hitler's last offensive. The odds were impossible, but in the frozen silence of the Ardennes, the defenders shows defiance. The question now was not whether the Germans would attack again, but how long the thin line of paratroopers could endure before being crushed. By December 21st, the trap had fully snapped shut around Bastogne. German divisions converged from every direction, their armored columns grinding forward despite the snow and clogged roads. Reports from prisoners revealed that more than 45,000 enemy troops with nearly 200 tanks now encircled the town, while the defenders numbered little more than 11,000 men. The imbalance was staggering. Yet the Americans refused to yield inside Bastogne. The strain of siege warfare grew unbearable. Ammunition stocks dwindled until some companies were allotted only 5 rounds per rifleman. The artillery crews of the 115th and 163rd Battalions received orders to fire only on verified targets, conserving shells for the inevitable assaults. Rations were halved, then halved again. Soldiers gnawed on frozen biscuits or melted snow for water that tasted of gunpowder and ash. The wounded crowded into cellars and churches where Belgian civilians tried to comfort them with scraps of food and whispered prayers. By Christmas Eve, more than 2,500 casualties lay within the town, many untreated, many awaiting morphine that never arrived. The German attacks came in waves, each one probing a different sector of the American perimeter at Champs, a small village northwest of Bastogne. Elements of the 126th Infantry Regiment attempted to punch through on December 22. They were met by paratroopers of the 302nd Regiment and tanks from the 10th Armored Division. Outnumbered more than 3-1, the defenders fought house to house, using bazookas at ranges of 20 yards, destroying 5 German panzers before the rest withdrew. Sergeant Ralph Hill remembered. We could hear the clank of their treads in the snow. Every shot we fired was life or death. When one of our bazooka rounds hit, the explosion lit up the night like daylight. N7 at Marvia and southeast of Bastogne. Another German thrust reached the very edge of the town. A platoon from Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry, held their ground for 12 hours under constant artillery and tank fire. One Sherman was knocked out. Its crew burned alive in the snow. Yet the line held. By morning, 30 German corpses littered the frozen fields, testimony to the defenders' grim determination. The situation within Bastogne grew darker with every hour. Fuel supplies were exhausted, forcing tanks and jeeps to stand idle, their engines frozen. Medical officers reported amputations performed without anesthesia, while nurses tore strips of cloth from their own uniforms to use as bandages. Civilians huddled in basements, terrified yet supportive of the Americans. One Belgian boy later recalled, "The soldiers gave us chocolate. Even when they had almost nothing, we thought they were angels in the snow." Morale, paradoxically, did not collapse. Officers reminded their men that Bastogne was no ordinary town, but the hinge of the entire Ardennes front. General Eisenhower himself understood its value. Without Bastogne, the German 5th Panzer Army could have driven west to the Meuse River and split the Allied armies Holding the town meant holding the fate of the campaign. The paratroopers knew it. In their foxholes, they repeated the words attributed to General McAuliffe: "We are surrounded." That simplifies things. And on December 22, the Germans decided to break American resolve with words instead of bullets. A delegation approached the lines under a white flag bearing a formelle letter demanding surrender. The document, signed by General Heinrich von Luttwitz, promised honorable treatment if the garrison laid down arms within 2 hours, but threatened annihilation if they refused. The demand carried the weight of overwhelming numbers, and the Americans knew their plight was desperate. Yet when the message reached McAuliffe, his reply was famously brief. Nuts. That word, at once dismissive and defiant, spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers laughed even in their misery, repeating the phrase until it became a slogan of resistance. A private later wrote, "That one word was better than 1,000 speeches. We knew we would never quit." The encirclement tightened further after the rejected ultimatum. German artillery poured more than 2,000 shells into Bastogne on December 23 alone. Fires consumed blocks of houses, and smoke choked the narrow streets. Yet above the town, a change appeared. The skies cleared for the first time in a week. Allied aircraft roared overhead, dropping bundles of food, ammunition, and medical supplies by parachute. Some loads fell into German hands, but many reached the starving defenders. It was not enough to break the siege, but it reminded the men that they were not forgotten. Thus Bastogne endured, a frozen island of defiance in a sea of steel. The Germans pressed harder. The snow fell thicker. The bodies piled higher. But the paratroopers and tankers, exhausted and starving, clung to their line. They had no illusions. They were outnumbered 4-1, outgunned in tanks, nearly 10-1, and their casualties mounted with every clash. Yet still they held. The siege had become a crucible, and within its icy walls, the legend of Bastogne was being forged. On the morning of December 22nd, 1944, the snow fell heavier, muffling the sound of distant artillery. Inside Bastogne, the situation was desperate. Ammunition had dropped to less than 5 rounds per man in some companies. Rations were reduced to half meals of frozen biscuits, and more than 2,000 wounded lay untreated in basements and barns. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, alongside fragments of the 10th Armored Division, held a perimeter stretching nearly 15 miles, manned by no more than 11,000 exhausted soldiers. Against them stood 45,000 German troops with close to 200 tanks, supported by relentless artillery fire. It seemed only a matter of time before the defenders broke. It was at this moment that the Germans attempted to shatter morale with words instead of shells. Shortly after dawn, a small delegation approached the American lines near the village of Mont de Saint-Étienne. They carried a white flag and a typed document signed by General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the German forces surrounding Bastogne. The message was stern. The American garrison was completely encircled. Further resistance was hopeless. Surrender would guarantee honorable treatment. Refusal would bring annihilation. The deadline was 2 hours. The demand was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. McAuliffe, weary but calm, read the note with disbelief. He knew the facts. His men were cut off, his supplies dwindling, and the weather prevented immediate relief. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Colonel Harry Kinnard, present in the command post, later recalled, "The general read the note aloud. For a moment he seemed puzzled. Then he laughed and said, 'Us surrender?' Oh, not." We all laughed with him. That became his answer. The official written reply was brief, typed on a single sheet of paper. It read simply, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." When the delegation returned to German lines with this message, confusion reigned. The translators struggled to explain the slang. Eventually, they conveyed that it meant absolute refusal. The Germans, expecting desperation, received defiance instead. Word of the response spread like wildfire through the foxholes. Paratroopers huddled in snow-covered trenches repeated the phrase with pride. Private Ralph Hill of Easy Company later wrote, "That one word lifted us more than 1,000 bullets. We were starving, freezing, but we laughed. We knew then that we would never give in." To the men, "Nuts" became a rallying cry, proof that their spirit was unbroken, even if their bodies were exhausted. The German reaction was immediate. Furious at the insult, they intensified their bombardment. More than 2,000 shells crashed into Bastogne that afternoon, setting houses ablaze and collapsing, already shattered walls. Yet the defenders, strengthened by their commander's defiance, endured. Sergeant Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry remembered, "The ground shook, glass shattered. Men cursed and prayed, but no one thought of quitting. Nuts was our answer to every shell." Outside the town, German staff officers realized time was slipping away. Every hour Bastogne held delayed the entire offensive. Fuel shortages plagued their armored divisions. Roads clogged with retreating columns from skirmishes elsewhere. Hitler's timetable depended on capturing the crossroads quickly. Instead, 11,000 stubborn Americans forced them into costly delays. Historian Hugh Cole would later write, "Bastogne was the stone in the German boot. Small, painful, impossible to ignore, and crippling the march to Antwerp." Inside Bastogne, the siege conditions worsened. The temperature dropped further. Frostbite cases rose into the hundreds, and supplies from airdrops were inconsistent. On December 23, clear skies finally allowed Allied aircraft to drop food, medical supplies, and ammunition. Yet many bundles fell into German hands, and the drops could not replace what was consumed each day. Still, the men cheered at the sight of American planes overhead. For the first time in a week, they felt connected to the larger war effort beyond the snowbound town. Despite these small comforts, the reality remained grim. By Christmas Eve, more than 3,000 Americans were listed as casualties within Bastogne. Nearly one-third of the garrison. Artillery units rationed shells to 2 or 3 per gun per day. Soldiers melted snow for water, sometimes tainted with blood from the dead. Belga Nurse, Augusta Chivet, later said, "We had no more medicine, only courage remained." And yet the spirit of resistance never faltered. The word nuts became etched into every man's memory, not just as a witty retort, but as a declaration of will. Bastogne would not surrender. The siege had become more than a tactical struggle. It was now a symbol of defiance. Hitler's armies, which had crushed entire nations, found themselves stalled by a single snowbound town. The world would remember that winter, not for the weight of German divisions, but for the power of a single word. Christmas Eve of 1944 settled over Bastogne with bitter cold and unrelenting fire. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling footsteps, but not the thunder of artillery. German batteries unleashed more than 2,000 rounds into the town that night, their explosions illuminating ruined streets and shattered houses. Fires spread from one block to another, and civilians huddled in cellars with soldiers, listening to the timbers creak under the pounding. For the defenders, there was no feast, no warmth, only the grim knowledge that they were surrounded, starving, and waiting for the next assault. Inside the makeshift hospitals, conditions bordered on medieval. More than 2,000 wounded filled every available cellar, hallway, and barn. Supplies had run out. Morphine was gone, sulfur powder exhausted, and bandages cut from bed sheets or torn from uniforms. Amputations were performed without anesthetic, soldiers biting down on sticks or belts as surgeons worked by candlelight. Belgian nurse Augusta Chiwi later recalled, "We prayed as we cut. The men screamed but did not complain. They only asked when they could return to their units. Courage became the only medicine." On the front lines, frostbite proved as deadly as bullets. Temperatures plunged below minus 10 degrees Celsius. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags or tore insulation from destroyed houses to line their boots. Frostbite cases numbered in the hundreds, some leading to amputations. Sergeant Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry remembered, "We would wake to find men frozen in their foxholes, rifles still clutched in their hands. The snow was both blanket and shroud. German attacks came ceaselessly, On December 24, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division struck the perimeter near Marvy and Champs. They fielded nearly 40 tanks supported by infantry companies. The defenders, with barely a dozen operational Shermans and dwindling bazooka rounds, fought desperately. In one clash, paratroopers destroyed 7 panzers at ranges less than 50 yards. Their rockets, leaving fiery streaks across the night sky. After 12 hours of fighting, the line held, though the snow was littered with wrecked vehicles and bodies. The German command knew time was running out. Fuel shortages crippled their mobility. The American refusal to surrender, epitomized by McAuliffe's nuts response, had become a dangerous symbol. Every day, Bastogne held delayed the timetable for the entire Ardennes offensive. Reports indicated that Patton's Third Army, more than 100,000 men strong, was pivoting north to relieve the town. Von Lüttwitz pressed harder, hoping to crush the defenders before reinforcements arrived. Within Bastogne, the defenders clung to scraps of hope. On December 23, the skies had cleared for the first time in a week, and Allied aircraft dropped more than 200 tons of supplies by parachute, ammunition, medical kits, and food, though scattered and partly captured by the Germans, gave the defenders just enough to endure. Soldiers cheered as C-47 transports buzzed low, their parachutes blooming white against the snow. For a brief moment, the sound of engines overhead felt like Christmas carols. Christmas Day itself was marked not by peace, but by slaughter. German panzer units launched their heaviest assaults yet, trying to storm Bastogne from multiple directions at Hemrul. Paratroopers and tankers faced a column of more than 20 enemy tanks. The Americans fired until their last rounds, knocking out 12 panzers in a single engagement. A captured German officer admitted later, "We expected them to collapse. Instead, they fought like wolves." By nightfall, the perimeter still held, though at a terrible cost. Casualties for the garrison had risen above 3,000, nearly 1/3 of the force. While Bastogne endured, help was finally on the way. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, had performed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war in less than 72 hours. He had pivoted his army of 3 corps, more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles from east to north through snowbound roads. Engineers cleared paths, tanks plowed through drifts, and columns stretched for miles. Patton himself drove his staff relentlessly, declaring, "We will relieve Bastogne, or we will be trying." On December 26, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division under General Hugh Gaffey broke through German lines south of Bastogne. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, a Sherman tank of the 37th Tank Battalion rolled into the village of Assenois, opening the corridor into the besieged town. The defenders cheered wildly as the first column entered Bastogne. For them, it was deliverance. For the Germans, it was the end of their chance to seize the crossroads. The relief did not end the fighting. The siege continued sporadically for weeks, with Bastogne enduring bombardments and counterattacks, but the spell was broken. The myth of German invincibility in the Ardennes had shattered against the frozen defiance of 11,000 men. Christmas at Bastogne had been a crucible of suffering, but it ended with hope. The knowledge that they had endured the worst and lived to see relief. When the tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division rumbled into Bastogne on December 26, 1944, and the siege was broken, but the battle was far from over. For weeks afterward, the town remained under constant shelling and sporadic attacks. Yet the German chance for a decisive breakthrough had already evaporated. Hitler's great gamble in the Ardennes had stalled, not against overwhelming armies, but against the defiance of barely 11,000 exhausted, half-frozen men. The numbers told a stark story. During the week of encirclement, the Germans committed more than 45,000 troops and nearly 200 tanks against the American garrison. They fired thousands of artillery shells, destroyed entire villages, and inflicted more than 3,000 casualties on the defenders. And yet Bastogne held. In comparison, American losses, though severe, bought time for the Allied High Command to regroup and counterattack. By early January 1945, the German offensive had run out of fuel, both literally and strategically. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne became a crucible that defined their legacy. Paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy and fought through Holland now faced their hardest test. Frostbite claimed more victims than bullets, and hunger gnawed more cruelly than shrapnel. Yet morale never collapsed. Sergeant William Hooper wrote after the battle, "We were never alone. We had each other, and we had our orders. Bastogne was ours, and that meant the war would go on our way." Their stubbornness turned what could have been a disaster into a turning point. The impact on the German command was equally clear. Von Lüttwitz, who had delivered the ultimatum demanding surrender, admitted after the war that Bastogne became a thorn in the German timetable. Every day lost at Bastogne meant fuel convoys delayed, armored spearheads stranded, and momentum squandered. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt-Later told interrogators, "The Americans defended Bastogne with a tenacity we had not expected. It ruined our chance of reaching the Meuse." In effect, a small garrison in a snowbound town crippled the last offensive of the Reich. On the Allied side, the defense of Bastogne became legend almost overnight. Newspapers across America carried headlines of the siege, turning McAuliffe's single-word reply, "Notes," into a symbol of American grit. The phrase echoed in speeches, cartoons, and soldier songs. It was humorous, almost absurd, yet behind it lay a steel determination that resonated with the home front. President Roosevelt praised the stand, and General Eisenhower later wrote, "The stubborn defense of Bastogne was of the first importance in blunting the German counteroffensive." The civilians of Bastogne paid a heavy price. Hundreds of Belgian families were killed or displaced, their homes shattered by artillery. Yet many remembered the Americans with gratitude. Belgian nurse Renée Lemaire, who worked tirelessly among the wounded, was killed during a bombing raid on Christmas Eve, becoming known as the Angel of Bastogne. Her sacrifice embodied the suffering shared by both soldiers and civilians in the frozen town. Strategically, Bastogne altered the trajectory of the Ardennes campaign. The German plan relied on speed, seize key crossroads, cross the Meuse, and drive to Antwerp within days. By holding Bastogne, the Americans forced the Germans into delay after delay. Fuel shortages worsened, and Allied counterattacks, led by Patton's Third Army from the south, and British forces from the north, squeezed the bulge until it collapsed. By late January 1945, the German army had retreated to its starting positions, having lost more than 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and the last reserves of its armored strength. Bastogne thus became more than a town. It became a metaphor for resistance against overwhelming odds. The American soldiers who endured the siege proved that determination could outweigh numbers, that morale could resist despair, and that one word could capture the spirit of a nation. General McAuliffe himself remained modest about his reply. In later years, he said, "I was not trying to be clever. It was just the first thing that came to mind, but it seems to have meant a lot." History ensured it meant everything. For the 101st Airborne Division, Bastogne sealed their reputation as an elite unit. They had been forged in Normandy, tested in Holland, and immortalized in the Ardennes. Their stand entered the annals of military history, studied in staff colleges, and remembered in memorials. Each year, veterans returned to Bastogne, standing once more in the snowy fields, remembering comrades who never left. The legacy of Bastogne endures not only in history books, but in the collective memory of a world that witnessed courage under fire. The siege did not decide the war by itself, but it revealed something greater: the capacity of ordinary soldiers to shape destiny through sheer will. In the frozen forests of Belgium, 11,000 men faced 45,000 enemies and answered with one word that would echo through generations. Bastogne was not just a battle, it was proof that resolve, even in the bleakest winter, can change the course of history. The siege of Bastogne ended long ago, yet its story refuses to fade. In that frozen December of 1944, a handful of 11,000 Americans stood against more than 45,000 Germans. They had no warm meals, no steady supplies, and no promise of survival. What they had was will and one defiant word that rang louder than artillery. Nuts! It was a reply so simple it seemed absurd. Yet in it lived the soul of a nation. That single word told the world that surrender was unthinkable, that even in hunger, frost, and fire, the human spirit could not be crushed. Bastogne became more than a town of 7 roads. It became a beacon, proof that courage could block an army, that defiance could outlast despair, that ordinary men in foxholes could bend the fate of a continent. Today, the fields are quiet, the snow falls gently, and only memorial stones mark where men once bled. But every winter, when the wind howls through the Ardennes, it whispers their answer. It whispers of frozen hands gripping rifles, of comradeship stronger than fear, of laughter in the face of annihilation. And it reminds us that Bastogne was not merely a battle, it was a promise that when freedom is cornered, it will stand, it will endure, and it will answer with unbreakable resolve.